The candle flame bent sideways, though no window stood open. She watched it from the doorway of the chapel, her fingers pressed against the cold stone frame, feeling the centuries breathe through the porous surface. The air tasted of wax and something older, incense perhaps, or the residue of prayers spoken by women whose names no one remembered. Her dress, gray as dawn mist, hung from her shoulders with the weight of borrowed dignity. 7 years she had worn such colors: smoke, ash, the pale undersides of leaves before rain. 7 years since they brought her here, barefoot and silent, to marry a man who never asked her name. The wedding had been brief, a transaction dressed in ceremony. She remembered the coldness of the ring as it slid onto her finger, too large, spinning loose whenever she washed linens or carried firewood. The chapel had been full of faces that refused to meet hers, nobles in their starched collars, servants with their practiced invisibility, and him. The Viscount. They called him other things when shadows grew long. The pale lord, the man who never aged, whose presence could silence a room faster than any raised voice. He had stood beside her at the altar with the stillness of carved marble, his hand never reaching for hers, his vows spoken to the Ong air above her head. She had been the price of peace. Her village, small and forgotten at the edge of his territory, had offered her up like a lamb to wolves. Not because she was beautiful, though some might have thought so in the right light, but because she was expendable. An orphan raised by the parish, taught to read by a wandering priest, fed on charity and the quiet resentment of those who gave it. When the Viscount's men came seeking a bride to seal the treaty, the village elders had pointed to her with the efficiency of those who knew how to cut their losses. Now the flame straightened, decided. She turned from the chapel and walked the corridor that connected the east wing to the manor's heart. Her footsteps made no sound. She had learned that early, how to move through space without disturbing it. The portraits watched her pass. Severe men with hunting dogs, women with pearls like tears frozen at their throats. None of them looked like her. None of them ever would. The household moved around her like water around stone. The housekeeper, Mrs. Blackwood, assigned her tasks that kept her visible but voiceless, arranging flowers in the grand hall, mending altar cloths, ensuring the Viscount's study remained dust-free, though he rarely used it. The other servants treated her with a courtesy so cold it burned. They called her my lady, with mouths that shaped the words like weapons. She understood. She was neither fish nor fowl, not quite servant, never quite mistress. A wife in name only, married to a man who slept in a tower room she had never seen, who took his meals alone, who moved through the manor like wind through ruins. But she had learned to watch. In 7 years, she had become a scholar of silences, an interpreter of glances and pauses. She knew which floorboards sang when stepped upon, which servants gossiped and which kept secrets, which rooms held warmth and which seemed to exhale cold no matter the season. She knew, for instance, that the Viscount walked the grounds at midnight, always alone, following paths that led nowhere in particular. She knew he kept books in languages she could not read, that he refused wine but drank water from a silver cup, that once, only once, she had seen him standing at a window, his hand pressed against the glass, his expression, so nakedly human it had frightened her more than his usual remoteness. She knew, too, that change was coming. It moved through the manor like a scent before storm, subtle, undeniable. Servants whispered about the approaching anniversary, about clauses in contracts written before she was born, about blood obligations and ancient rights. Mrs. Blackwood had begun watching her with a new intensity, as if cataloguing her for some future reckoning. The Viscount's sister, Lady Marguerite, had arrived from the capital 3 days prior, her trunks full of black silk and sharper intentions. Tonight there would be a gathering. The great families of the region, summoned to witness something no one would name aloud. She had been instructed to dress appropriately, to stand where directed, to speak only if addressed. The same instructions given to furniture. She reached the manor's heart, a vast hall with a ceiling that vanished into shadows, where chandeliers hung like frozen constellations. Servants moved with anxious purpose, polishing silver that already gleamed, adjusting tapestries that hung perfectly straight. Through the tall windows, twilight pressed against the glass, turning the world outside to watercolor. And there, at the hall's far end, she saw him. The Viscount stood before the massive fireplace, his back to the room, one hand resting on the mantel. Even in stillness, he commanded space, bent light to his will. His coat was black as split ink, his hair silver pale, though he looked no older than 30. From this distance, he could have been a painting himself, some Gothic study in solitude and shadow. As if sensing her gaze, he turned. Their eyes met across the length of the hall. She forgot to breathe. In 7 years, he had never truly looked at her. Not like this. Not with an attention that stripped away walls and left only the terrible intimacy of recognition. Something moved in his expression, quick as lightning, gone just as fast. Then he inclined his head, a gesture so slight it might have been imagined, and turned back to the fire. She stood frozen, her heart of fist beating against her ribs. Outside, the first stars appeared, cold and distant. Inside, candles flickered as if someone had walked past them too quickly, though no one had moved at all. Before her thoughts could settle, Mrs. Blackwood appeared at her elbow, smelling of lavender and disapproval. "My lady," she said, the title a stone in her mouth. "It is time to prepare." She followed the housekeeper up the spiral staircase, her hand trailing the banister worn smooth by generations of palms. In her chamber, small, Spartan, overlooking the kitchen gardens, a dress had been laid across the bed. Not gray this time. Black. The color of mourning, or of beginnings that refused to announce themselves. She touched the fabric. Silk, expensive, severe. It felt like a promise or a threat. Through the narrow window, she could see the last of daylight bleeding from the sky, and below, in the courtyard, carriages beginning to arrive. Horses stamped and snorted, their breath white in the cooling air. Voices drifted up, laughter that sounded like breaking glass, greetings sharp with political necessity. She began to dress, her fingers steady though her pulse was not. Whatever was about to begin, she would meet it as she had met everything else. With silence, with watching, with the quiet strength of those who have learned that survival is its own form of grace. The black silk settled around her like a second skin. She fastened the small buttons at her wrists, each one a tiny defeat of hesitation. In the mirror, cracked at one corner, a flaw she had learned to see around, she barely recognized herself. The dress transformed her from shadow to something sharper, something that might cast a shadow of its own. Downstairs, a bell began to ring, calling the household to assembly. She descended. The great hall had filled with bodies and their expensive scents, perfume and pomade, wine breath and wool. Ladies in jewels that caught the candlelight like captured stars. Gentlemen with watches chained across their waistcoats, measuring time as if it belonged to them. They moved in clusters, in careful orbits around power and its absences. She recognized faces from previous gatherings. Lord Ashford with his predatory smile, the Duchess of Moorland trailing daughters like a comet its tail, the bishop whose blessing felt more like examination. Lady Marguerite held court near the windows, her beauty the kind that intimidated rather than invited. She wore mourning, for whom, she never said, and wielded it like armor. Her eyes found the Viscount's wife immediately, assessed her with the precision of an anatomist, and dismissed her just as quickly. The message was clear. You are a curiosity, nothing more. A footnote in a history I am writing. Mrs. Blackwood guided her to a position along the wall, between two marble columns that felt like sentries. You will stand here, she said, not unkindly, simply stating fact. You will observe. You will not speak, unless the Viscount addresses you directly. She nodded. It was the same instruction given every time, the same careful choreography of insignificance. The Viscount entered last. The conversations didn't stop. That would have been too obvious. But they changed texture, became performances of themselves. He moved through the crowd with minimal acknowledgement, his presence a stone dropped into water, ripples spreading silent and sure. He wore black, as always, but tonight there was something different. A tension in his shoulders, a focus in his gaze that suggested purpose rather than obligation. He took his position at the head of the hall, before the fireplace where ancestral shields hung crossed like frozen combat. The assemblage arranged itself into a rough semicircle, waiting. Lady Marguerite positioned herself to his right, the place of honor. The bishop stepped forward with his book of rites, his face arranged in professional solemnity. My lords and ladies, the bishop began, his voice trained to fill cathedrals. We gather on this auspicious evening to mark 7 years since the union that brought peace to these lands. 7 years of stability, of enough. The single word from the Viscount cut through the bishop's rehearsed speech like a blade through silk. The room inhaled and forgot to exhale. The Viscount stepped forward, away from the fireplace, into the space between himself and the assembled witnesses. He did not look at his sister, though she stiffened beside him. He did not look at the bishop, though the old man's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. Instead, his gaze swept the room, touching each face with the weight of judgment, until finally, impossibly, it landed on her. For 7 years, he said, and his voice was not loud but it filled every corner, I have kept the terms of a bargain I did not make. I have honored a peace purchased with a life I did not value as I should have. I have allowed this house to treat my wife as if she were a ghost, convenient and silent, present but powerless. Lady Marguerite made a small sound, quickly suppressed. Lord Ashford's smile vanished. The Duchess clutched her eldest daughter's arm. The room seemed to tilt, gravity redistributing itself around new information. Tonight, the Viscount continued, and now he moved, walking with deliberate slowness across the marble floor, each footstep a small thunder. I break that silence. I claim what was given but never acknowledged. I ask, no, I demand, that you see what I have been blind to. He stopped 3 paces from where she stood against the column, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, could smell the winter on his clothes, could feel the heat of him in the cool air. I demand that you recognize my wife, not as symbol or treaty or afterthought, but as the woman who has borne your contempt with more grace than any of you deserve, who has moved through this house like water, sustaining it without thanks, shaping it without acknowledgement. He extended his hand toward her, not to take hers, that would come later, or never, but palm up, an offering of space. Come, he said, and it was not command but invitation. Stand where you have always belonged. The silence in the hall was absolute, broken only by the fire's crackle and somewhere distant, a clock marking time that had suddenly become irrelevant. She looked at his hand, at his face, at the assembled witnesses whose expressions ranged from shock to calculation to something that might have been fear. She thought of 7 years of corridors walked alone, of meals eaten in kitchens, of nights spent listening to the manor's bones settle. She thought of the village that had given her away, of the girl she had been, barefoot and silent. She thought of the woman she had become in the spaces no one watched, in the margins of other people's stories. She stepped forward. Her hand did not reach for his, not yet, perhaps not ever in the way stories promised, but she moved into the space he had created, stood beside him in the center of the hall, and lifted her chin. The black dress whispered against marble. The candles burned straighter. Lady Marguerite's face hardened into a mask of fury. The bishop clutched his book as if it might save him. Lord Ashford laughed once, short and bitter, a man who had just lost a wager he thought certain. The Duchess turned away, pulling her daughters with her, already calculating new alliances. But the Viscount did not move. He stood beside his wife, finally, in more than name, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of something that had been building for 7 years in the silence between them. Let it be known, he said to the room, to the witnesses, to history itself, that from this night forward, she is not my shadow. I am hers. The fire roared in its hearth. The chandeliers swayed though no wind moved. And in the cracked mirror of a small room overlooking the kitchen gardens, if anyone had been there to see it, the reflection showed not one figure in black, but 2, standing side by side in a hall that had finally learned the difference between silence and peace. Outside, snow began to fall, the first of the season, covering the ground in white like a page turned to a new chapter. The carriages would leave soon, carrying scandalized whispers back to distant estates. The servants would gossip in the kitchens, reassessing loyalties and power. Lady Marguerite would plot in her chambers, sharpening knives of influence and blood. But in the great hall, for this moment, there was only truth spoken aloud, and the sound of 2 people breathing in the same space, learning the architecture of recognition, the weight and the lightness of finally being seen. Before you immerse yourself in this story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10, and tell us which city you're joining us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The days that followed did not bring revolution, but they brought rearrangement. The manor, like all old houses, resisted change with the stubbornness of stone and tradition, yet something fundamental had shifted in its foundations. She woke the morning after the gathering to find her belongings, few as they were, had been moved from the small chamber overlooking the kitchens to a suite in the eastern wing, 3 doors down from the Viscount's own apartments. The room had tall windows that faced the gardens, a fireplace that actually drew properly, and a bed large enough that she felt lost in it the first night, and used to such abundance of space. Mrs. Blackwood delivered the news with a face carved from granite. "His lordship's orders," she said, setting down fresh linens with hands that trembled ever so slightly, anger or fear impossible to tell. "You are to take your meals in the dining-room henceforth. A lady's maid will be assigned to you by week's end." The housekeeper did not wait for response, simply turned and left, her keys jangling at her waist like small accusations. Through the open door, she could hear whispers in the corridor, the rustle of skirts as servants hurried past, desperate to glimpse the woman who had somehow, impossibly, stepped from the margins into the text. She stood at the window, watching frost melt from the garden paths as morning sun touched them. 7 years, she had tended those gardens in the early hours before the household woke, pulling weeds and deadheading roses, her hands learning the language of thorns. Now below, she could see the head gardener directing his apprentices, and she wondered if they knew, if they had been told that the silent woman who once worked beside them was now someone they must call my lady with straight faces and bowed heads. The thought made her tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. At noon, a young maid appeared at her door, hardly more than 16, with nervous hands and a curtsy practiced to perfection. "My lady," she said, the words careful in her mouth, "luncheon is served in the small dining-room. His lordship requests your presence." She followed the girl through corridors she knew by heart, but which felt somehow different now, as if the walls themselves were reconsidering her. They passed Lady Marguerite in the gallery, the Viscount's sister examining a painting with theatrical interest, her posture radiating disapproval like heat from coals. Their eyes met for half a second, enough for Marguerite to communicate volumes of contempt before the lady turned away, dismissing her with the efficiency of someone who had decided she was not worth the effort of overt cruelty. Not yet, anyway. The small dining-room was intimate, almost cozy, with a table that could seat 8 but today held settings for only 2. The Viscount stood at the window, his back to the door, his hands clasped behind him. He did not turn when she entered, but she saw his shoulders shift, a subtle acknowledgment of her presence. "Thank you, Alice," he said to the maid, who curtsied and fled, clearly relieved to escape the awkwardness. Silence stretched between them like frozen water, delicate and dangerous. She waited, her hands folded at her waist, unsure of the protocol for this new arrangement. Were they to pretend at casual comfort? Were they to acknowledge the strangeness of sitting across from each other after 7 years of careful distance? Finally he turned. In daylight, without the drama of the great hall and its witnesses, he looked different. Still striking. That was inescapable. The sharp lines of his face, the peculiar shade of his eyes like water over stone, but also tired. Human. There were shadows beneath those eyes, faint as bruises, and a tension around his mouth that suggested he slept as poorly as she did. "Please," he said, gesturing to the chair. "Sit." She sat. He sat. Between them, dishes steamed gently, roasted chicken, winter vegetables, bread so fresh she could smell the yeast. Her stomach reminded her that she had eaten nothing since yesterday's breakfast, too nervous to take food before the gathering, too unsettled to seek it after. He served her first, a gesture so unexpected she almost protested. But something in his expression stopped her, not coldness, but a kind of fierce intentionality, as if the small act of service mattered more than she could understand. "You must have questions," he said, cutting his own portion with precise movements. "I have no right to expect your silence any longer." She considered this, turning it over like a stone in her hand. "Why now?" she asked, her voice rusty from disuse in his presence. "Why not before?" He set down his knife, gave her his full attention. "Because I am a coward," he said simply. Because I told myself the treaty required distance, that to acknowledge you would complicate matters, best left simple. Because it was easier to treat you as an arrangement than as a person. Because I am, in most ways that matter, a fool. The honesty of it struck her silent. She had expected deflection, political maneuvering, perhaps cold rationalization. Not this raw self-indictment. The treaty, she said carefully, what does it actually say? About us. It says we must remain married for 7 years to maintain the peace, he replied. After that, he paused, something complicated moving behind his eyes. After that, we are free to dissolve the union if we choose. The village's obligation ends. Mine ends. Yours ends. I see. She did, suddenly, with perfect clarity. The gathering had not been celebration but potential farewell. The 7-year mark offered liberation, a chance to undo the bargain that had bound them. His sister and the others had expected him to announce dissolution, to send her back to the village or pension her off to some distant estate. Instead, he had claimed her, publicly, irrevocably. Why? The question emerged smaller than she intended. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw him weighing words, discarding them, searching for truth that would not sound like pretty lies. Because you deserve to be seen, he said finally. Because somewhere in these 7 years, while I was not paying attention, you became the best thing in this house. Because I watched you care for things, gardens, books, servants who were cruel to you, with a gentleness I have never managed. Because when I imagine the next 7 years, the next 70 years, I cannot imagine them without you moving through these halls, real and recognized. He paused, then added quietly, because I am selfish, and I want you to stay. The words settled over the table like snowfall, soft and undeniable. She did not know what to do with them, these strange gifts offered too late, or perhaps exactly on time. Her throat felt tight, her eyes hot, but she refused to let tears come. Not here. Not yet. And if I wanted to leave, she asked, needing to know if the cage had truly opened or simply changed shape. Then I would arrange it, he said without hesitation. A house in the city, funds, whatever you needed. I would not stop you, but I would regret it every remaining day of my life. She believed him. That was the most surprising thing. She believed the man across from her, this stranger she had been married to for 7 years, meant every word he said. I don't know what I want, she admitted, the truth feeling dangerous on her tongue. Then stay until you do, he suggested. Not as you were, never again as you were, but as yourself. Learn this house. Learn me if you can bear it. And if, at the end of that learning, you decide to go, I will let you. With blessing and without bitterness. She looked down at her plate, at food that had grown cold while they talked. This will not be easy, she said. Your sister hates me. The servants don't know how to speak to me. Half the county thinks I've bewitched you. Let them think it, he said, and there was something fierce in his voice. Let Marguerite rage. Let the servants learn. Let the county talk itself hoarse. You have spent 7 years making yourself small to fit their comfort. I am asking you to stop. She met his eyes across the table. And you? What will you do? I will try, he said, to become worthy of a kindness I do not deserve. I will try to be what I should have been from the beginning. A partner, not a ghost. I will fail, probably often. But I will try. Outside the window, clouds were gathering, promising more snow. Inside, the fire crackled in its grate, and the clock on the mantel ticked away seconds that felt, for the first time in years, like they might be leading somewhere other than more of the same. She picked up her fork. He did the same. They ate in silence, but it was different now. Not the silence of strangers avoiding each other in a hall, but the silence of two people learning the contours of a tentative piece, the first careful movements in a dance neither had ever been taught. When the meal ended, he stood and offered his hand. She looked at it, pale, long-fingered, steady, and after a heartbeat's hesitation took it. His grip was warm, careful, and when she rose, he did not release her immediately, but held on a moment longer, as if memorizing the feel of her fingers in his. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For not running. Yet. She almost smiled. The day is young. This time he did smile, just a slight curve at the corner of his mouth, but it transformed his face, made him look younger, less like a Gothic portrait, and more like a man who might, possibly, know how to laugh. "Indeed it is," he agreed, and then, still holding her hand, added, "Would you walk with me? There is something I would like to show you." She nodded, and he led her from the dining room, through corridors warming with afternoon light, past portraits and tapestries and servants who stopped to stare, and then remembered themselves and looked away. They climbed the spiral staircase, higher than she had ever ventured, until they reached a door she had never seen opened. He produced a key from his pocket, turned it in the lock. The door swung inward, revealing not a bedroom as she expected, but a library. A small, circular room with walls lined floor to ceiling with books, with windows that looked out over the entire estate, with a fireplace and 2 deep chairs angled toward it, and between them, a small table holding a chess set, the pieces carved from dark and light wood, beautiful and unused. "This is my space," he said, releasing her hand so she could explore. "The one place in this house that has been only mine. I would like it to be ours, if you wish. A place to talk, or read, or sit in silence without audience." She moved to the shelves, ran her fingers over leather spines. Poetry, philosophy, histories, and she pulled out a slim volume, fairy tales, the pages worn soft from reading. She looked at him, surprised. "My mother's," he explained, something vulnerable in his voice. "She died when I was young. I keep them to remember her voice, reading to me before sleep." She opened the book, saw margin notes in a feminine hand, small hearts drawn beside favorite passages. "She had beautiful handwriting," she said softly. "She would have liked you," he said. "She always said the house needed more gentleness, more life. I think she would be glad that I finally listened." She closed the book carefully, returned it to its place. Then she walked to one of the chairs, sat down, and looked up at him. "Teach me to play," she said, gesturing to the chess set. "Chess." "Everything," she corrected. "How to be a wife who is not a shadow. How to navigate this life I have been thrust into. How to be seen without breaking." He sat in the chair opposite, his expression serious. "Only if you teach me in return." "Teach you what? I know nothing you don't know better." "You know how to tend things," he said. "How to care without ownership. How to be strong in silence. How to survive with grace. These are not small knowledges." She looked at the chess pieces between them, the elaborate dance of strategy frozen in wood. "Then we will teach each other," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "We will." And there, in that circular room above the world, as snow began to fall and honest outside the windows, they began the slow work of becoming real to each other. Not husband and wife as the treaty had decreed, but 2 people learning to build something true from the ashes of an arrangement, finding in the ruins of silence the first fragile notes of an honest conversation, a shared space, a possibility neither had dared to name. The chess pieces waited, patient as stones, ready to teach them about strategy and sacrifice, about the long game and the careful movement toward something that might, if they were brave enough, lucky enough, gentle enough, eventually feel like home. The weeks that followed unfolded with the strange slowness of dreams, time stretching and compressing in unpredictable ways. She learned the rhythms of the library, began to understand which hours the Viscount kept. Early morning before the household woke, late evening after obligations released him. She learned he liked coffee black and scalding, that he had a habit of reading with one hand braced against the mantel, that he sometimes spoke Latin in his sleep, dreaming of lessons from childhood. He learned she preferred tea with honey, that she had taught herself to read music though she had never touched an instrument, that she cried silently when moved by poetry, tears slipping down her cheeks without sound or ceremony. He brought her a violin one morning, left it in the library without comment, and the next day heard it singing through the walls, uncertain at first, then growing confident, the notes like birds finding their wings. The household adjusted with the grudging reluctance of an old ship-changing course. Mrs. Blackwood remained coldly correct, but she no longer assigned the mistress menial tasks, no longer spoke to her as if she were a particularly slow student. The younger servants took their cue from this and began to offer genuine courtesy, even warmth. The head gardener started asking her opinion on plantings, deferring to her knowledge of which roses thrived in shade, which herbs preferred neglect. But resistance came too, sharp and persistent as thorns. Lady Marguerite did not leave after the gathering as expected. Instead, she extended her visit indefinitely, taking up residence in the West Wing and using it as a base for quiet warfare. She held informal salons for the county ladies, gatherings she did not invite her brother's wife to, but which everyone knew were designed to undermine her. She circulated stories, nothing actionable, nothing that could be directly confronted, but poisonous nonetheless. The wife was unsuitable, common, possibly unwell, certainly manipulative. How else to explain the Viscount's sudden devotion to a woman he had ignored for 7 years? The whispers reached her through channels both obvious and subtle. A servant would fall silent when she entered a room. A tradesman would look at her with something like pity. A letter would arrive from the village, from the priest who had taught her to read, warning her gently that people were talking, that her sudden elevation had caused concern, that she should be careful. She showed the letter to the Viscount one evening in the library. He read it by firelight, his face growing colder with each line. "I will speak to him," he said flatly. No, she took the letter back, folded it carefully. "He means well, and he is not wrong to be concerned. This is strange, what we are doing. Marriages do not transform overnight. People do not change their natures because we ask them to. Then what would you have me do? Ignore it while my sister poisons every well in the county? I would have you trust me," she said, "to fight my own battles. You cannot shield me from every cruel word, every suspicious glance. If I am to be more than your shadow, I must cast my own light, even if that means standing in their storms." He looked at her for a long moment, something fierce and frustrated in his expression. "You are braver than I am," he said finally. "No," she corrected. "I have simply had more practice being invisible. It makes you observe things others miss, including when and how to make yourself seen." So she attended the next salon uninvited, simply appeared in the drawing room where Lady Marguerite held court, arrived early, and positioned herself by the window where the afternoon light would find her. When the other ladies entered, they stopped short, caught between their conditioning to be polite and their desire to follow Marguerite's lead. Lady Marguerite recovered first, her smile sharp as glass. "My dear sister," she said, the possessive dripping with irony, "what a pleasant surprise. I had not realized you were interested in our little discussions." "I thought it time," she replied evenly, "to become better acquainted with my neighbors. I have been remiss in my social duties." "Remiss? Yes." Marguerite glided to her chair, arranged her skirts just so. "Though one could argue you had little choice in the matter, given your particular circumstances." The other ladies settled, watching this exchange with the avid attention of those hoping for blood without having to shed it themselves. The Duchess of Moreland fanned herself unnecessarily. Lady Ashford examined her rings. Mrs. Carleton, the parson's wife, looked genuinely uncomfortable, caught between social obligation and Christian charity. "Circumstances change," she said, accepting tea from the servant with a nod of thanks, "as do people's understanding of them." "Indeed." Marguerite sipped her own tea, a cat with cream. "Though I confess, I find myself puzzled by such dramatic transformations. 7 years of one arrangement, then suddenly," she snapped her fingers, "another. It seems almost theatrical, don't you think?" "I think," she said carefully, "that true change is rarely dramatic. It happens in small moments, small kindnesses, small recognitions. The dramatic part is simply when others finally notice what has been growing quietly all along." Mrs. Carleton made a small approving sound, quickly covered by a cough. The Duchess's fan stilled. Lady Ashford's expression softened fractionally. Marguerite's smile hardened. Prettily said, "You have a gift for metaphor, no doubt all that time in the gardens, observing nature's little lessons. But we are not plants, dear sister. We are people, with histories and obligations and social structures that cannot be pruned away because they have become inconvenient." "I do not seek to prune anything," she replied, "only to grow where I was planted. Is that not what we are all taught? To bloom where we are placed, to make beauty from whatever soil we are given." "Some soils are richer than others," Marguerite said, and there it was, the bar beneath the pleasantry, the reminder of her origins, of the gap between them. She met the lady's eyes directly. "True, but the strongest roots often grow in poor soil, reaching deeper, holding tighter. Whereas delicate flowers in rich earth sometimes have shallow roots, beautiful, but easily uprooted by the first strong wind. The silence that followed was electric. The Duchess actually gasped. "Mrs." Carlton pressed her napkin to her mouth, hiding what might have been a smile. Lady Ashford looked between the two women as if watching a fencing match. Marguerite's face went very still, very white. For a heartbeat, something dangerous flickered in her eyes. True rage, quickly banked. Then she smiled, and it was all teeth. "My brother has chosen well," she said, and every word was poison honey. "You have more spine than I credited. I wonder if he knows what he has invited into his house, a weed that thinks itself a rose." She set down her teacup with perfect control. "I am neither weed nor rose, my lady. I am simply a woman learning to exist outside the shadows. If that troubles you, I suggest you examine why another woman's emergence feels like a threat." She stood, smoothed her skirt, offered a general curtsy to the room. "Thank you for the tea. I hope to see you all Sunday at service." And then she left, walked out before anyone could respond, before Marguerite could rally, before her own hands could begin to shake with the adrenaline of having finally pushed back. She made it to the corridor before her knees went weak. Made it to the next turning before she had to stop, press her hand against the wall, breathe deeply to steady herself. She had done it. She had faced them, held her ground, and not broken. The fear remained, but it was a smaller thing now, something she could carry rather than something that carried her. Footsteps approached. She straightened, composed herself, but it was only Mrs. Carlton, the parson's wife, hurrying after her with surprising speed for a woman of her years. "My lady," she said, slightly breathless. "Forgive me, I should not have followed, but I could not let you leave without." She paused, seemed to gather courage. That was remarkably well done. Lady Marguerite has needed someone to stand up to her for years. We all simply lack the nerve. She felt something, a knot in her chest. "I hope I did not cause offense." "Offense?" Mrs. Carlton laughed quietly. "My dear, you gave voice to what half the county has been thinking. That woman has lorded her position over us all since she could walk. It is past time someone reminded her that birth is not the same as worth." They walked together toward the main hall, their steps echoing softly on marble. "You will have made an enemy," Mrs. Carlton added more seriously. "She will not forget this." "I know," she said, "but I was already her enemy. At least now I am one who fights back." The older woman patted her arm. "Your mother would be proud, I think." She stopped walking. "You knew my mother?" Mrs. Carlton's expression grew gentle. "Only a little. She passed when you were barely 3. But I remember her. She had your same quiet strength, your same way of seeing through pretense. She worked in the parish house before she fell ill. Always had a kind word, even when people gave her none." "I did not know that." Her voice came out smaller than intended. "No one ever spoke of her to me." "Because they were ashamed," Mrs. Carlton said bluntly. "She was a good woman who made one mistake, loving a man who would not acknowledge her. But she raised you as best she could before the fever took her, and the village took you in because it was the Christian thing to do. Though I am not certain we did it with Christian grace." The word settled over her like a weight and a gift at once. She had spent so long thinking herself an accident, a burden, a mistake that needed constant apology. To learn her mother had been real, had worked, had been kind, it shifted something fundamental in how she understood her own spine. "Thank you," she managed, "for telling me." Mrs. Carlton squeezed her hand. "You are not alone, my lady. Not any more. Some of us see what you are building here, and we approve. Do not let the cruel voices convince you otherwise." After the woman left, she stood in the empty hall, letting the conversation sink into her bones. Then she climbed the stairs to the library, needing the quiet sanctuary of books and firelight. He was there, reading by the window, but he looked up when she entered. Something in her face must have shown because he set the book aside immediately. What happened? She told him, leaving nothing out, the salon, the confrontation, Mrs. Carlton's revelations about her mother. He listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as she described Marguerite's attacks, then softer when she reached the end. "I should have warned you about my sister," he said finally. "She has always been difficult. especially toward anyone she perceives as threatening her influence. Why does she hate me so much? I have taken nothing from her. You have taken everything, he corrected. Not deliberately, but thoroughly. You have my attention, my regard, my... He stopped, seemed to reconsider his words. You represent change. Marguerite despises change. She has spent her life perfecting the art of managing this household from the shadows, and now you are here, visible and acknowledged, disrupting her carefully constructed order. I do not want to manage anything, she protested. I simply want to exist without apologizing for it. I know, he said, but to people like my sister, mere existence is a claim to territory. Your presence challenges hers, and she will fight you for it. She moved to the window, looked out over the grounds turning silver with twilight. Mrs. Carleton told me my mother was kind, even when people were not kind to her. I want to be like that, strong but not cruel. How do I fight without becoming what I am fighting against? He came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, still careful not to touch without invitation. You do exactly what you did today, he said. You speak truth without apology. You hold your ground without aggression. You remember that dignity is not the same as docility, and strength is not the same as force. And if that is not enough, then I will stand with you, he said simply. Not in front of you, shielding you from consequences, but beside you, sharing them. This is what partnership means, I think. Not one protecting the other, but both facing the storm together. She turned to look at him, this man she was learning in increments, discovering in layers. In the fading light, his features softened, became almost vulnerable. You have changed too, she observed. You are not the man who stood silent at our wedding. No, he agreed. I am trying not to be. It is harder than I anticipated. This business of being human, of allowing oneself to want things, to care about outcomes. I spent so long perfecting detachment that I forgot how to do anything else. Why? The question emerged before she could stop it. What made you choose distance? He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something beyond the window, perhaps beyond the present entirely. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old wounds carefully tended. My father was not a kind man. Powerful, respected, feared, but not kind. He taught me that emotion was weakness, that to care was to give others weapons against you. He arranged my mother's life like chess pieces, moved her around the board until she had nowhere left to go. When she died, he remarried within the year, chose a woman who would not challenge him, would not need him, would not break his carefully controlled world. He paused, his jaw tight. I swore I would not be like him, but I did not know how to be different. So I chose the opposite of his passion. I chose nothing. No engagement, no vulnerability, no risk. I thought that made me better. It only made me empty. She felt the truth of it settle between them, the shared understanding of people who had survived by becoming small, by taking up as little space as possible. And now I am trying to learn another way. You are teaching it to me, whether you know it or not. How to be present without dominating. How to care without possessing. How to offer without demanding return. Outside, the first stars appeared, cold and bright. Inside, the fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across book spines and wooden floors. She thought of her mother, loving someone who would not acknowledge her. Thought of herself, married to someone who had not seen her. Thought of cycles, and how they might be broken, if both people were willing to do the difficult work of breaking them. I forgive you, she said quietly. He looked at her, startled. For what? For the 7 years. For the silence. For the way you looked through me as if I were glass. She met his eyes. I forgive you because I think you are trying. And because holding anger against someone who is genuinely attempting to change seems like carrying stones that I no longer need. Something moved in his expression, relief and grief and gratitude tangled together. I do not deserve that. Perhaps not, she agreed. But I am not giving it because you deserve it. I am giving it because I deserve to stop carrying the weight of resentment. This is for me as much as for you. He nodded slowly, accepting the gift as it was offered. Thank you, he said. I will try to be worthy of it. Just be honest with it, she corrected. Worthiness is too high a bar. Honesty is enough. They stood together at the window as night completed its claim on the day, neither speaking, both learning the language of presence without pressure, of companionship without performance. Below, the grounds settled into darkness, the gardens she had tended becoming abstract shapes in the gloom. But she knew their contours, knew which paths led to the roses and which to the herbs, knew the map by heart even when she could not see it. Some things, she was learning, did not require light to be known. Some things revealed themselves better in the dark, the truth of what you carried, the shape of who you were, the possibility of what you might become. The Viscount reached out slowly, giving her time to step away, and when she did not, he took her hand. Not possessively, not demandingly, but with the careful reverence of someone holding something precious and fragile, something that could still choose to fly away. She let him, let herself be held, just a little, in that quiet room above the sleeping house. Let herself imagine a future where this strange, tentative partnership might grow into something solid, something real, something that could weather the storms gathering on the horizon. Because storms were coming. She could feel them in the way the house held its breath, in the sharpness of Marguerite's smile, in the whispers that followed her through corridors. But for tonight, in this moment, there was peace. There was honest conversation and shared silence and two hands learning the shape of each other. It would have to be enough. The winter deepened, and with it came the season of decisions. The Viscount had business in the capital, meetings with solicitors and bankers, obligations that could not be indefinitely postponed. He asked if she would accompany him. Not ordered, not assumed, but asked, as if her answer might actually be no. She considered refusing, considered staying in the manor where at least she knew the terrain of her battles. But something in her resisted that safety, that retreat. If she was to be more than a shadow, she could not hide from the world that would judge her. "I will come," she said, and saw relief flash across his face before he schooled it to neutrality. They departed on a morning sharp with frost, the carriage bearing his family crest rumbling over frozen roads. Lady Marguerite had left 2 days prior, ostensibly to return to her own estates, but they both knew she was laying groundwork, preparing society for their arrival with whatever poison she had perfected. The journey took 3 days. They stopped at coaching inns where she attracted curious stares, this woman traveling with the Viscount, neither clearly servant nor clearly wife, occupying some undefined space that made innkeepers uncertain how to address her. He corrected them every time, firmly but without anger. "My wife," he would say, and the temperature of the room would shift. On the third night, in a small room with a fire that smoked more than it warmed, she asked him about the capital. What should I expect? He considered this, staring into the inadequate flames. Judgment, he said finally. Society there is less forgiving than the county, more conscious of lineage and propriety. You will be scrutinized. They will look for weaknesses, for proof that you do not belong. My sister will have made certain they are primed for scandal. And you? What will they think of you? That I have lost my mind, he said with a slight, bitter smile. That I have been enchanted or coerced, or have fallen into some strange madness. The Viscount, who famously kept his distance from all entanglements, suddenly appearing with a wife no one knew existed, claiming her publicly, it will be the talk of every salon. We could still turn back, she offered, though her heart did not want to. No, he said firmly, we cannot, because turning back would confirm every suspicion, every whispered doubt. We go forward, or we concede defeat before the battle begins. So they went forward. The capital rose before them on the 4th day, a sprawl of stone and smoke, church spires and guild halls, the river cutting through it like a vein of silver. The Viscount's city residence stood in the elegant district, a townhouse of pale stone with iron railings and windows that reflected clouds. They arrived at dusk. Servants she had never met lined up to greet them, their faces carefully neutral. The housekeeper here, Mrs. Thorne, assessed her with eyes that missed nothing and revealed less. My lady, she said, the title precise as a blade. Your rooms are prepared. Shall I send up hot water? Please, she managed, overwhelmed by the grandeur, the strangeness, the feeling of being utterly out of her depth. The Viscount must have sensed it, because he dismissed the staff with a gesture and led her up the stairs himself, to a suite of rooms that overlooked the square. They were beautiful, All silk wallpaper and polished wood, paintings in gilt frames, a bed that could sleep four. These were my mother's rooms, he said quietly. She loved the morning light here. I hoped you might find them comfortable. She walked to the window, looked down at the square where gas lamps were being lit one by one, small fires pushing back the dark. It is beautiful, she said. And terrifying. Yes, he agreed. London is both. But you have faced worse than fancy rooms and critical strangers. You have faced erasure, invisibility, the slow death of being ignored. This, he gestured at the elegant space. This is just theater. Uncomfortable, but survivable. Will you teach me the steps of the dance? She asked. I do not know how to navigate this world. I will try, he promised, though I am not certain I know it well myself anymore. I have spent so many years avoiding it that I may be as lost as you. Somehow that helped. They were both uncertain, both learning, both vulnerable to the judgments of a world that wanted them to fail. At least they would stumble together. The invitations began arriving the next morning. Dinner parties, salons, musical evenings, balls. Society had decided to observe them up close, to measure and weigh and determine whether they were scandal or curiosity or something else entirely. He refused most of them, accepting only those from families he deemed genuinely civil. Even so, the calendar filled quickly. She would need clothes, he explained, the sort of gowns suitable for formal occasions. A dressmaker was summoned, a stern woman with pins in her mouth and hands that measured with ruthless efficiency. You have good bones, the dressmaker pronounced, as if this were both compliment and diagnosis. We can work with this. What colors does my lady prefer? She almost laughed. She had never had preference in such matters, had worn whatever was provided, whatever would not draw attention. I do not know, she admitted. The dressmaker looked at her with something that might have been sympathy. Then we shall find out. Try this. She draped a length of deep blue silk across her shoulders. The color transformed her, made her skin seem to glow, her eyes darker and more defined. The Viscount, who had been reviewing correspondence across the room, looked up and went very still. That one, he said, his voice rougher than usual. Definitely that one. The dressmaker smiled knowingly. I thought so. And perhaps the green for evenings, and a burgundy for the more formal affairs. Nothing too pale. She has the coloring for depth. Over the next days, fabrics appeared and disappeared. Patterns were debated, styles adjusted. She stood for hours while the dressmaker pinned and tucked, creating armor disguised as elegance. And slowly in the mirror, she began to see someone new, not the shadow wife of the manor, but a woman who might hold her own in rooms full of people whose approval she did not need. Their first engagement was a small dinner party hosted by Lord and Lady Pemberton, old friends of the Viscount's family. They are kind, he assured her, or as kind as anyone is in this city. If you can survive them, you can survive anyone. She dressed with care, the blue silk whispering against her skin, her hair arranged by a maid who worked with gentle efficiency. When she descended the stairs, the Viscount was waiting, and the way he looked at her made her feel, for the first time in her life, genuinely beautiful. Ready? He asked, offering his arm. No, she said honestly, but I will do it anyway. His smile was small and real. That is all courage ever is, doing the thing while afraid. They rode through the city streets, gas lamps casting pools of light, the carriage wheels loud on cobblestones. She tried to calm her breathing, tried to remember Mrs. Carleton's words, that she was her mother's daughter, that she had survived worse than critical glances over teacups. The Pemberton house blazed with light, windows glowing like lanterns. They were greeted at the door by liveried servants and ushered into a drawing room where a dozen guests mingled with champagne and practiced ease. Conversation faltered when they entered. Every head turned. She felt the weight of those gazes like physical pressure, assessing her dress, her bearing, her right to be there at all. Then Lady Pemberton swept forward, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a smile that seemed genuine. My dear Viscount, how wonderful to see you. And this must be your wife. We have been absolutely dying to meet you. She curtsied, managed to find her voice. Thank you for having us, Lady Pemberton. Oh, the pleasure is entirely ours. Come, let me introduce you to everyone. They are dreadfully curious, I warn you, but mostly harmless. And so it began, the parade of names and titles, the carefully worded questions that were really interrogations, the smiles that measured and weighed. She answered as honestly as she could without revealing too much, aware of the Viscount beside her, a steady presence that kept her anchored. Some guests were genuinely welcoming. Others were politely venomous, their compliments edged with questions about her background, her family, how she and the Viscount had met. She navigated it as best she could, remembered to breathe, remembered that she had already faced down Lady Marguerite and survived. At dinner, she was seated between Lord Pemberton and a young man named Mr. Hartley, who proved surprisingly easy to talk to. He asked about her interests, listened when she mentioned her love of gardens and music, did not treat her answers as curiosities, but as genuine responses. "The Viscount is a lucky man," he said at one point, and seemed to mean it. Across the table, she caught her husband's eye. He raised his glass, slightly, a private salute that no one else would notice. She raised hers in return, felt something warm unfurl in her chest. She was surviving this. More than surviving, she was navigating it, finding her footing in this strange new world. After dinner, the ladies withdrew while the men took port. Lady Pemberton, settled beside her on a sofa, patted her hand. "You are doing wonderfully, my dear. I know this must be overwhelming." "It is," she admitted, "but everyone has been very kind." "Most of us," Lady Pemberton corrected. "There are always a few who cannot help themselves. I heard Lady Marguerite has been spreading tales. You should know that sensible people do not credit them. We can see what you are to him, what he is becoming because of you. That is worth more than any pedigree." The words brought unexpected tears to her eyes. She blinked them back, composed herself. "Thank you, my lady. That means more than you know." When the men rejoined them, the Viscount came directly to her side, as if pulled by invisible thread. They spoke to a few more guests, accepted invitations to future events, and then, pleading fatigue from travel, made their escape. In the carriage, she finally allowed herself to breathe fully. "That was—" "You are magnificent," he interrupted. "Gracious and genuine, and entirely yourself. They will talk about you for weeks." "Is that good or bad?" "Good," he said firmly. "Very good. You gave them nothing to use against you, and everything to admire. Lady Pemberton adores you. I could see it. That alone will open doors." She leaned back against the seat, suddenly exhausted. "I did not think kindness would be so tiring." "It is its own form of battle," he agreed, "requiring different weapons, but battle nonetheless." They rode in comfortable silence, the city passing outside the windows in patterns of light and dark. When they reached the townhouse, he helped her down from the carriage, his hand warm on hers. "Thank you," he said, "for being brave tonight. I know it cost you." "Thank you," she replied, "for standing with me, for making me feel like I was not alone in that room." Something passed between them in that moment. Not romance, not yet, but recognition. The acknowledgement of partnership earned through trial, of trust built in increments, of two people learning to face the world together rather than separately. They climbed the stairs side by side, and when they reached her door, he paused. "Sleep well," he said. "Tomorrow we rest. No engagements, no obligations. Just peace." "That sounds wonderful," she said, and meant it. He hesitated, as if wanting to say more, then simply nodded and continued to his own rooms. She watched him go, then entered her beautiful borrowed chamber, where the morning light her husband's mother had loved would find her when it came. She undressed slowly, carefully hanging the blue silk that had been her armor for the evening. In her nightgown, she went to the window, looked out at the square where a few late travelers still moved through pools of lamplight. The city hummed with life even at this hour, so different from the manor's stone silence. But she was different too. Not the shadow wife anymore, not the invisible woman who arranged flowers and kept silent. She was becoming someone else, someone who could walk into rooms full of strangers and hold her ground, someone who could love without losing herself, who could be seen without breaking. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was, she realized, the beginning of her own life. She climbed into the enormous bed, pulled the covers up, and closed her eyes. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new eyes to face, new judgments to weather. But tonight, she had survived. She had been brave and genuine in herself, and that, she thought as sleep began to claim her, was enough. For now, it was more than enough. If this story found a mirror in your soul, leave your comment and share. Sometimes, what hurts in us is what most makes us human.